Welcome everybody to today's session. My name is Donna Morgan. I'm a map and terminologist at SNOMED International. Today's stream of SNOMED CT Expo 2020 is Demonstrating Implementation Excellence. I'd like to introduce Anna Rossander. She's a PhD student at Gothenburg University in Sweden. Her presentation is entitled A Literature Review of SNOMED CT Terminology Binding. And can I remind everybody that you can submit questions into the Q&A box, just type them in and all questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. And I'll now hand you over to Anna. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So my name is Anna Rossander and I'm going to talk to you about a literature review that I've done with my colleagues Lars Lindskjöld, Agneta Ranrup and Daniel Karlsson. The learning objectives of this presentation is primarily to understand what terminology binding is and its role in use in SNOMED CT, but then also two of the findings from the study, namely common problems when doing terminology binding and recommendations doing terminology binding from our review of scientific literature. So the first question is, what is actually terminology binding? And this is a definition by Graham, Grieve and Tim Benson, the process of establishing links between elements of SNOMED CT or any other terminology and an information model is called terminology binding. So I'll show you some examples. So this is what you might see like in an electronic health record or a template of some sort or a flowchart. There will be questions and there will be answers. Similar in FHIR would look like this. There will be a code and then different values for that. Or in OpenEHR, there will be elements and data values. Typically, it could look like this, for instance. There are allergies and then different types of allergies that you could enter that the patient or person the record is about has. In this example, I've chosen nuts, apples, eggs, and guinea pigs. And if you would do a value set binding, which is a type of terminology binding, you would choose relevant concepts for the value set. So these are four concepts from SNOMED CT. This is also called subset development. Basically, you're taking a small part of SNOMED CT and making it into a subset relevant for a certain area. Another type of terminology binding is meaning binding, where you show what a specific part of the information model actually means. And this is the example to the left with the allergic disposition. It's not the question actually, it just says that this is what this part of the information is about, if the patient has any allergies or not. A similar thing, or maybe actually very much the same, is mapping. And basically the only difference, as you can see compared to the previous picture, is that the list of terms in the existing system is still around. If you do a subset development, maybe you don't keep the notes or whatever you use to develop the subset or to decide what relevant context they should be. But if you have a legacy system where you have legacy data, or maybe a system which you are keeping in parallel with the new system, you will want to be able to communicate between these, and you need some sort of map that you will keep, and you will keep both the initial list and also the SNOMED CT concepts that you've mapped to. So that's mapping, but the process of choosing the concepts from SNOMED CT is very, very similar. Now, these are four other concepts from SNOMED CT which you could think represent the same thing, and in a sense they do. I just want to show you that this is one of the tricky parts, that there are different hierarchies and different ways of doing the terminology binding, and you need to make a stringent choice and stick to it. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to use and reuse your information. So the question that we posed in my research group was, what is known about terminology binding when it comes to SNOMED CT? So we made a big literature review, a literature search. We searched in three different databases, PubMed, Scopus, and Web of Science. And we searched for articles that were tagged with SNOMED, of course, and then either map, terminology binding, information model, implement, or subset. And then we excluded papers that were mapped with ICD, because there are very, very many papers on binding from SNOMED CT to ICD for reimbursement issues, and that's not what we were after. We were after terminology binding in implementations. We identified some 1,100 plus papers, and there were lots of duplicates, and we removed them. And in the end, we had 616 papers that we screened, and we chose, or we found 83 relevant for our question, and we read the full texts, and another 28 were excluded because they were not on topic really, or they were not full texts, or the process was not sufficiently described. In the end, we had 55 papers, which we have read. They were published between 2004 and 2020, so the most recent ones are just from this spring. Half of them were published in journals, and the other half were conference proceedings. Only 2 of the papers were published in medical outlets. The remaining were published in informatics or computer science outlets. And as you can see from the pie chart, the majority is from North America and then Europe. So when we read the papers, we looked at these 7 different topics, you could say, that were covered in the papers. And I will talk to you a bit about the project incentives and output, the problems, and the recommendations. So the different types of papers that were included were of these 4, or could be divided into these 4 categories. The first 3 are somewhat sequential, where the first one is evaluation of applicability. There are papers describing how you can evaluate if SNOMED CT is suitable for the area you're working within, perhaps compare it to other terminologies, perhaps end up in some sort of percentage of coverage of the terms that you wanted to try to find. And then there are descriptions of implementations where people have done mappings of templates or systems or flowcharts, and the output has been some sort of, well, map or subset or module. The third type are recommendations, where there is often a project described as well, but the main target of the paper is some sort of recommendation as to how this should be done. There are not very many that are pure recommendations, but a few. And then there are development of tools, and they're quite different. They're often, or they're about software development. Sometimes it's an entire tool developed, or it's about algorithms or processes that should be used when developing such tools. For instance, how words should be stemmed or truncated, or how close concepts should be used. So they're more towards computer science, you could say. So what did we find in all of these papers? Well, generally when it came to problems, you can say there were these 4 major types of problems. Input material problems are of different types, obviously. One example is context, that there is an assumed context when you've been writing these things in the existing system, but it's not explicit in the wordings. For instance, some surgeries are always done robotically, so you don't spell that out, but it's sort of assumed that if it's one of these procedures that have been done, it was done robotically. So if you need to find the relevant SNOMED CT concept, you would have to know this to interpret it correctly. Another input material issue would be that there are several terms used for the same thing, or several terms used for different things, which is normal in language, but needs to be understood. A specific issue pertaining to people who have been doing projects on guidelines is that the terms that are used in guidelines are often more general than what you would find in a patient record. For instance, you might find in a guideline something about metabolic disorders, whereas what's stated in the record would be diabetes, for instance. And then you need to decide what sort of level to choose your concept from, and if the subsumed concepts in SNOMED CT should also be correct according to the guideline. A last problem with input material would be relative terms, where you have a list and then at the end there is other or none of the above, which there's no corresponding concept for in SNOMED CT, so you would have to solve it some other way. Then there are problems related to SNOMED CT itself, and the most common such concept is there's a lack of concept or term. Despite relevant searches, one cannot be found. This is very frequent, but it's not a major problem. Most papers state that it's relatively easy to have new content added when needed, so this is not a big problem. Another problem is the concept model, where there are variations in how people choose hierarchy. For instance, if they choose procedures or observable entities. Some people state problems with the possibility to state negations, which of course also could be handled in an information model. A few papers state problems about subsumption issues, where the subsumption in SNOMED CT is correct, but it's not correct for the clinical setting which they are in. They do not want to include all the subsumed children of the concept, and there's no good way of solving that. Post-coordination is mentioned, but it's rarely used, and it's not because it's complicated, it's because the systems where these terms are intended to be used cannot manage or cannot handle such long terms. So that's why it's not used. Another final problem with SNOMED CT is actually lack of knowledge about SNOMED CT. Some of the papers we've read have stated solutions that are not allowed according to the SNOMED CT concept model, and these have still been published and they've passed reviewers. So there's some sort of lack of knowledge in the community as to how SNOMED CT can be used. A third type of problems is the lack of a common information model. Many projects state that the reason for doing the project is trying to share information, for instance, about allergies to other systems, other hospitals. But if you don't have the same information model, you won't do the same terminology binding, and you won't be able to share the data. So there's a need for this. I mean, this is a major issue generally within informatics, that we need to use international standards and use the same standards. But obviously this is a problem also here. If we were to have a more general information model, we could also share the subsets or the value sets that have been developed easily than now. The final type of problem is lack of tooling, and some people state problems with browsers, that when working together but using different browsers, you get different results. Often this is probably due to the browsers having different settings regarding extension and version, but still it's a problem. And then there are also problems with spreadsheets, which can be difficult to manage, especially when they get extensive. Some of the problems regarding hierarchies, for example, would have been prevented if there was supportive tooling. And there is tooling, but none of the commercially available tools are mentioned in the papers in the review. So the next question is if there are any recommendations, and there are not that many stringent recommendations to be found, unfortunately. These four have been clearly stated in several papers. Many papers press for the need of both domain knowledge and informatics knowledge. It's impossible to do a good terminology binding with only one of these. And they also state that it's not like a waterfall process. You cannot first do some sort of sorting and cleaning of the input data and then just hand it over to the informaticians and have them map it. It has to be a to and fro process where you can answer questions and discuss together. They also press on the process. Many papers explicitly describe a process and state this can be used again, this can be helpful to others. They're a bit different, obviously, but all of them start as some sort of sorting of the input data, and then there's the actual binding, and then there's some sort of validation. Many of the papers stress that it will be helpful with tooling, and especially supportive tooling. Obviously, the papers on tooling development argue for this, and they also show, the ones of them that have done prototypes of their software show that this decreases workload, improves speed, and also decreases problems. There are no tools that are completely automatic. There's always need for a human validation towards the end. People also suggest using some type of tool to share subsets as opposed to like mailing spreadsheets to each other, and that this would be beneficial for sharing work, but also during the process, but also afterwards to share finished work. And the final recommendation is to validate output. I mean, that's part of the process, but it's very important. And many of the papers stress that they find that they improve their quality when they do the validation. It's not just something you tick off, it's actually an important step. So that was my final slide. Thank you for listening, and please participate in the discussion.
Thank you, Anna, for your interesting and informative presentation. And thank you, everybody who's attended this session. Can I ask that attendees give us a moment while we switch over from our pre-recorded content so that Anna can address the questions you have been submitting live. Please also note that this session will be available on the event platform for the next 3 months. Thank you. Hello, thank you, Anna. I can see now that we've got some question and answers from attendees, so I'm going to launch straight into those because I'm conscious we've got a hard finish at the top of the hour. So starting with the first question that came through, Anna, what measures are you taking to encourage the use of SNOMED CT in day-to-day practice by clinicians?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. It's just maybe we're not. Well, you can't ask the question. You can't put this question just specifically to me. You could say that what should be done. Maybe is that the question? And there is the papers that we've been reading and the projects that we've been looking at are informaticians or system developers who've been trying to implement SNOMED CT, and that's obviously a step. We need to use it. And then the users, in the sense of clinicians, need to be able. I think they need to be more informed about that SNOMED CT exists, so they can ask for it, because they don't. They see this as some sort of thing being imposed upon them that they maybe don't actually even want. It's a very complex question. I think I probably did not answer it. Please maybe just type again a more specific part of the question.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So moving on, what human readable terms used by clinicians, SNOMED terms or local terms?
I would suggest that you should always use the SNOMED term, and that if there's no appropriate term in SNOMED, then you should create the synonym that is equivalent to what the clinicians use. Because if you stick with the local term, you will have a mapping problem, but it will be a mapping and it will be demand maintenance. So that would be my suggestion.
Okay, thank you. Another question, please. Is the paper free for download, and if yes, where from?
No, it's not yet. I hoped when we sent in the abstract that it would be finished by now, but it's not. I'm sorry about that. If you mail me, I can remember to mail you the paper when it's done.
Okay, moving on then, I'll continue through the questions. SNOMED implementation model, would it be advisable to have a terminology server or API based?
A terminology or API based? Oh, is that?
That's a question.
This is not something that people have been discussing very thoroughly in the papers, so I cannot answer based on what we read in the papers that we included. And my personal answer would be that really depends on the rest of your setting.
Okay, so hopefully that answers the question there. A question from Lars. What is your recommendations to have the organisations to move faster to implement SNOMED CT? So what are your recommendations to have the organisations to move faster to implement SNOMED?
That is a very tricky question, Lars. Well, one would be to involve the users, i.e. the clinicians, not only doctors, obviously, but like all healthcare staff, to select relevant terms to somehow, as described in many of the papers, that many of them stressed that it was the cooperation between a subject matter expert of some sort and a terminologist or informatician, and when they worked together and they chose the relevant terms for the user interface, that was when they got good results. So that would be my recommendation, because then you automatically spread knowledge, like about SNOMED CT, and these clinicians would know that they've entered it in this way and that they can also if the system is good enough, could also retrieve the data and use the data, and they would see the benefits.
Okay.
That's what I would suggest.
Moving on to another question then, we have a question from Anne, and she says, "Hi Anna, thank you for an interesting presentation. Do you have any suggestions on how we can support people in performing terminology bindings that are in accordance with the concept model?"
That's a very good question, Anna, and you have written one of the papers that are included in the review where you looked at this, and we'll come back to that in the results. There are not, I think having some sort of implementation guide is a good idea, and that's Alistair Kenworthy talked about that previously today, that he also asks for this as like toolings that are needed. But one problem is that many people use different information models, so you would still have to follow the SNOMED CT concept model, obviously, but you would still have to cater for different information models. Maybe some sort of forum fora where you could have support from SNOMED CT sort of professionals would be one solution, because in some of the papers that we read, people have suggested solutions that are not in accordance to the concept model. So they've misunderstood it, and this has been published to its past reviewers as well. So I think there is somewhere there's a lack of knowledge, and maybe, I mean, that knowledge exists, but it's not widespread. So maybe somehow we could sort of offer support in this, because it's not easy.
Hopefully that goes some way to answering your question. A question from Stefan. Considering your comments on to and fro between knowledge and informatics, is there advice in the papers on how and in what form the participants with knowledge can communicate with the informatics?
The papers who've mentioned this have not, just a minute. They have described how they've done, some of them, that they've had workshops or they've had repeated meetings, and sometimes they've only said that it's been iterative discussion. So it's hard to say that one way or the other is better. Many of them also say that this is like a bottleneck, that clinicians don't have time for this, or they don't get the time. So no, there is no answer in the papers about this. Coming back again to Alistair's presentation about his wish box for tooling, he suggested there would be a way to have domain experts. This is my interpretation, but domain experts modeling, not in the authoring tool, or maybe in the authoring tool and doing suggestions. And I think that will be one way forward, that you could have some sort of tooling to support gathering of that knowledge, because sometimes if you show a concept to a clinician, they would say, well, this should have this attribute, or they don't understand all of SNOMED CT, but they understand they're part of clinical work. So that would be a very interesting way forward, I think.
Thank you. Olaf asks, were there any papers in the review relating to terminology bindings of guidelines or recommendations?
There were a few. Majority of the papers with recommendations started the other way, with clinical data, but there were a few that started with guidelines with the target to sort of make some decision support system. So there were a few, and there was also one paper on patient information leaflets, trying to annotate it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that's all the questions that we've had submitted throughout the session that Anna's delivered. Providing there are no more questions now, then I think we're just hitting a good time to complete so that we can move on to the following session.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'd like to thank Anna for a lovely presentation, very interesting, informative, and thank you to all the attendees in the room and the questions that have come forward as well. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.